I don't tell this story often, mostly because it makes me feel uneasy just thinking about it. But also, people tend to brush it off, saying it's just your imagination or you were overtired. Maybe they're right. But if you've ever had one of those moments when something feels wrong, so wrong you can't ignore it, you'll understand why I'll never forget that night. It was about 4 years ago in early December. I'd been driving back from visiting my parents in a small town upstate. The drive wasn't too long, 5 hours or so, but the weather had turned, and a steady drizzle made the road slick and visibility poor. By the time I hit the halfway point, it was pitch dark and I was fighting to stay awake when I spotted a flickering neon sign that read Rest Haven Motel, vacancy. I figured it was a sign to call it a night. The building wasn't much to look at, just a low row of rooms with peeling paint and dim yellow lights. But it was cheap and I was too tired to care. The guy at the front desk looked like he hadn't seen a customer in days. He didn't ask many questions, just took my cash and slid me a room key attached to one of those oversized plastic tags. Room 12. I thanked him, though he didn't acknowledge me, and made my way down the cracked concrete path. When I stepped into the room, my first thought was that it smelled old, like damp carpet and faint cigarette smoke. The bedspread was patterned with some kind of faded floral print, and the bedside lamp had a crooked shade. The heater hummed like it was working overtime, but at least the room was warm. I tossed my bag on the chair and locked the door, throwing the deadbolt and sliding the chain across for good measure. It wasn't long before I noticed the noise. At first, I thought it was just the hum of the heater or the pipes settling. But as I lay on the bed staring at the cracked ceiling, I realized it was coming from outside. It was faint but distinct, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps on the walkway. I told myself it was probably another guest, though I hadn't seen any other cars in the lot. The steps passed my room, then stopped for a long moment. I held my breath, waiting to hear them move on, but instead I heard something even worse. The faintest rattle of my doorknob. My heart jumped into my throat. I sat up quickly, grabbing my phone and staring at the door. The chain rattled slightly, but the lock held. I didn't call out. I didn't move. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps started again, heading further down the row of rooms. When I finally worked up the nerve to peek out through the peephole, the walkway was empty. I tried to brush it off. Maybe the guy was just drunk, confused about which room was his, but something about the slow, methodical sound of those steps kept replaying in my mind. I told myself to relax. I turned on the TV for background noise and scrolled through my phone for a while. Eventually, I started to feel tired again, and I figured I'd been overreacting. But just as I was about to turn off the light, I heard it. A faint knocking. Not at my door, but at one of the other rooms down the row. It was soft, almost polite, like whoever was knocking didn't want to be noticed. I sat frozen, listening. The knock came again, and then silence. I told myself it wasn't my problem. Maybe it was a guest trying to reach a friend, or maybe it was the desk clerk checking on something. I tried to block it out, but my nerves were already shot. I lay back down, staring at the ceiling, every muscle in my body tense. Sometime later, maybe an hour, maybe less, I woke up to a noise that made my blood run cold. It wasn't footsteps or knocking this time. It was the unmistakable sound of my doorknob turning. Slowly, carefully, the chain rattled again, harder this time, as if someone was testing its strength. I grabbed my phone and instinctively called the front desk. The phone rang and rang, but no one answered. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I crept out of bed and moved toward the door. Through the peephole, I could just make out a figure standing there, their hand on the doorknob. They weren't moving anymore, just standing completely still. My heart was pounding so loud I thought they might hear it. I backed away from the door, careful not to make any noise. I didn't want to wait and see what would happen next. I grabbed my bag, slipped on my shoes, and slowly slid the window open. The drop to the ground was only a few feet, and I managed to climb out without making too much noise. I crouched in the shadows for a moment, looking around. The parking lot was empty except for my car and one other, a rusty, beat-up sedan parked near the far end of the building. The office lights were off and the desk clerk was nowhere in sight. I made a break for my car, not daring to look back at the room. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking, and finally got the door unlocked. I didn't waste time buckling up, just started the engine and sped out of there as fast as I could. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The motel was barely visible in the darkness, but I thought I saw something of figures standing in the parking lot, watching me leave. I didn't stop driving until I was miles down the road, where I finally pulled into a gas station. I sat there for a long time, trying to calm down. When I finally went inside to grab a coffee, I asked the cashier if she knew anything about the motel. She frowned. "You stayed there." "Thought they shut that place down a while ago. There was some incident, guy was breaking into rooms. I think someone got hurt." I felt sick. I never found out exactly what happened at that motel, and I'm not sure I want to. All I know is that night taught me to trust my instincts. I don't care how tired I am, I'll never stop at a place like that again. I don't tell this story often, not because it isn't true. I wish it weren't, but because every time I think about it, the unease comes back. The kind that crawls up your spine and whispers that you're not as safe as you think you are. It was a couple of years ago during a road trip for work. I was driving cross-country to meet a client, and the day had dragged on longer than I'd planned. Around midnight, exhaustion hit me like a brick. I could barely keep my eyes open. I had no choice but to pull over at the first motel I saw. It wasn't the kind of place you'd pick if you had other options. The sign was missing half its letters, and the parking lot was cracked and overgrown. But I was too tired to care. I parked, grabbed my overnight bag, and headed inside. The lobby smelled faintly of damp carpet and cleaning chemicals. A tired-looking man sat behind the counter, flipping through a magazine. He didn't seem surprised to see me, though it was well past midnight. "Need a room?" he asked, barely looking up. "Yeah, just for the night," I replied. He slid a key across the counter. "Room 13, around the back." He didn't even ask for my name or ID. I found that odd, but again, I was too tired to argue. The hallway leading to room 13 was dimly lit, the kind of lighting that made every shadow look like it was hiding something. The air was stale, and the carpet squished faintly under my shoes like it had never fully dried from some long-forgotten flood. When I opened the door to my room, it was, well, a room. A bed with a scratchy-looking blanket, a TV bolted to the wall, and a single window with thick beige curtains. The wallpaper was peeling at the corners, and the air smelled faintly metallic, like rust. I locked the door, bolted it, and wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. Something about the place made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the silence, too quiet, even for a place like this. No cars passing by, no hum of distant conversation, just nothing. I tried to shake off the unease and got ready for bed, but as I lay there staring at the stained ceiling, I couldn't relax. My thoughts kept returning to the man at the desk, the way he barely looked at me, like I was just one more face he didn't want to remember. Around 1 a.m., I started hearing noises. At first, it was faint, a soft shuffle, like footsteps in the hallway. I figured it was another guest and tried to ignore it, but then the sound stopped right outside my door. My chest tightened. I held my breath, straining to hear. After a few seconds, there was a quiet tapping. Not on the door, but on the wall, just above the headboard. It wasn't random, though. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was testing to see if I'd react. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Hello." I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No response. The tapping stopped, but the silence felt heavier now, pressing down on me like a weight. I told myself it was probably nothing. Old buildings make weird noises, right? Maybe the pipes were acting up. But then I heard it again. This time, it was closer, like it was coming from inside the room. I jumped out of bed, flicked on the light, and scanned the room. Nothing. The window was shut, the bathroom empty. The door was still bolted, with the chair wedged firmly under the handle. But the feeling that I wasn't alone hadn't gone away. I decided I wasn't going to sleep. I turned on the TV for some background noise, hoping it would drown out whatever I thought I was hearing. But the reception was terrible, just static and flickering images. I turned it off after a few minutes, realizing it was only making things worse. By now, it was nearly 2 a.m. and I was wide awake. That's when I noticed something strange. The chair I'd wedged under the door handle wasn't where I'd left it. It had shifted just a few inches, but enough to make my stomach drop. I grabbed my phone and tried to call the front desk, but there was no signal. No Wi-Fi either. I cursed myself for not checking earlier. I stood there clutching my phone, debating what to do. My mind was racing. Had someone actually tried to get in, or was I losing it? I considered leaving right then and there, but the thought of stepping out into that silent hallway made my skin crawl even more than staying put. I decided to wait it out. Dawn was only a few hours away. I'd leave first thing in the morning. I propped the chair back under the handle, double-checked the lock, and sat on the edge of the bed, my back against the wall, watching the door like my life depended on it. For a while it was quiet again. Too quiet. My eyes felt heavy, but I didn't dare close them. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that I'd laugh about this in the morning. But then, just as I was starting to let my guard down, I heard it, breathing. Soft, shallow breaths coming from just outside the door. I froze. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't the wind or the heater. Someone was out there, standing just inches away, separated only by a thin slab of wood. The breathing stopped. My pulse thundered in my ears as I waited, barely daring to inhale. Then, slowly, the doorknob rattled. Whoever it was didn't knock or call out. They just turned the knob back and forth, testing it, as if they knew I was inside. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a cheap desk lamp, and stood ready, my whole body trembling. The rattling stopped. I waited, my heart hammering, expecting the worst. But nothing happened. Minutes passed, then an hour. The hallway outside was silent. At some point, exhaustion won out. I must have dozed off sitting there, because the next thing I knew, pale sunlight was streaming through the curtains. For a split second, I thought it had all been a bad dream, but then I saw the chair. It was no longer under the handle. It was across the room, tipped on its side like it had been thrown. My throat tightened as I realized I hadn't moved it. I grabbed my bag and bolted out of the room, not even bothering to lock the door behind me. The hallway was empty, the silence even heavier in the daylight. When I reached the front desk, the clerk was gone. The lobby looked abandoned, like no one had been there in years. I left the key on the counter and got the hell out of there. As I sped away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. For just a moment, I thought I saw someone standing in the window of room 13, watching me leave. I never went back to that part of the country, and to this day I don't know what really happened that night. Maybe it was just a prank. Maybe I was overtired and imagining things. But there's one detail I can't shake. When I looked up the motel later, out of morbid curiosity, I found out something that still gives me chills. Room 13 wasn't listed. According to the records, that motel only had 12 rooms. I don't usually talk about this night, not because I want to forget it, I can't, but because every time I tell someone, they look at me like I'm crazy. Still, I think there's value in sharing it. Maybe someone will hear this and think twice before dismissing their gut feeling. It happened about 5 years ago. I was driving back from a work conference, a 6-hour trip through mostly rural highways. It was late October, and by the time I left the conference, the sky had already gone dark. I had planned to make it home that night, but a sudden sharp headache forced me to rethink my plan. About halfway through the drive, I saw the glowing red neon sign, Roadside Motel, Vacancy. It wasn't exactly appealing, a single-story, U-shaped building with a cracked parking lot and flickering lights, but I was too tired to be picky. The woman at the front desk looked bored and barely acknowledged me as I walked in. She slid a clipboard across the counter without even looking up. "Room 8, she said, handing me a key attached to a bulky wooden tag. Her tone was mechanical, like she'd said the same words 1,000 times. The room smelled faintly of mildew, and the carpet had stains I didn't want to think about. The heater rattled like it was on its last legs, but it worked. I told myself it was just for one night, locked the door and put the chain on for good measure. I was lying on the bed, scrolling through my phone when I first noticed it. A faint scratching noise, almost too quiet to hear. At first, I thought it was the heater struggling to keep up, but then I realized it was coming from the wall behind the bed. I froze, holding my breath. The scratching stopped. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it, but then it started again. It wasn't consistent, more like something or someone trying to be quiet but failing. I got up and pressed my ear to the wall. The sound was definitely coming from the next room. Scratching, then a soft, rhythmic thumping. My immediate thought was some kind of animal, maybe a raccoon trapped in the walls. I went to the front desk, The woman looked just as bored as before. "Do you have someone staying in room 7? I asked. She raised an eyebrow. "Not tonight." "Why?" I hesitated. "I think I hear something coming from that room." She sighed, grabbed a flashlight, and gestured for me to follow her. When we reached room 7, she unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room was dark, empty, and just as uninviting as mine. She flipped on the light. The bed was made, the bathroom door was open, and nothing seemed out of place. She gave me a look that clearly said I was wasting her time. "Must be the pipes," she said flatly, and walked out. I stood there for a moment staring into the room. It was colder than mine, and something about it made my skin crawl. I shut the door and went back to my room, trying to convince myself that she was right. I lay back down, determined to get some sleep. But an hour later I heard it again. The scratching, then the thumping. Only now it was louder. I grabbed my phone and opened a white noise app, cranking up the volume to drown out the sound. It worked for a while, but just as I was starting to drift off, a new noise jolted me awake. The sound of the doorknob turning. I shot up, heart pounding. The chain on the door was rattling as though someone was trying to open it. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The rattling stopped. I stared at the door, expecting the knob to turn again, but nothing happened. After a minute, I got up and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I sat back on the bed, phone in hand, debating whether to call the front desk. But what could I even say? The bored woman already thought I was imagining things. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing I remember is waking up to the sound of footsteps outside my door. Slow, deliberate steps moving up and down the hallway. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped, and then, to my horror, I heard something slide under my door. I jumped out of bed and flipped on the light. A piece of paper lay on the carpet. I stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. Written in uneven, shaky letters were the words, "Check the mirror." My hands started to shake. Slowly, I turned toward the bathroom. The mirror over the sink was fogged up, as though someone had recently taken a shower. I hadn't used the bathroom since I checked in. The air felt heavy, suffocating. My brain was screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't make myself move. Instead, I walked toward the mirror, each step feeling like it might be my last. When I wiped the glass with my hand, I almost collapsed. The words were written in the condensation. "You're not safe." I didn't think. I just grabbed my bag, threw on my shoes, and ran out of the room. The woman at the front desk wasn't there, and I didn't stop to look for her. I jumped in my car and drove until I couldn't see the neon sign anymore. I ended up sleeping in a rest stop parking lot with the doors locked. The next morning, I went back to the motel. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted answers, maybe closure. But when I got there, the place was surrounded by police tape. A uniformed officer stopped me before I could get close. "Can I help you?" he asked. "I stayed here last night," I said, my voice shaky. "What happened?" The officer's face darkened. "You're lucky you left when you did," he said. "We got a call this morning. Found the woman who worked here in one of the rooms. Looks like she'd been dead for days." I felt the blood drain from my face. "But I spoke to her," I stammered. "She gave me my key." The officer frowned. "That's not possible." I didn't say anything else. I just got back in my car and drove home. To this day, I don't know who or what I spoke to that night, but I'll never stay in a roadside motel again.